Hi everybody, I'm Michael Tierra, and I'm an herbalist and a California licensed acupuncturist. And I've been working with herbal medicine since 1968. It all started in a commune up in Northern California called Black Bear Ranch, which actually still exists. The group of us who founded it had put it in a trust, and it still remains there for people to go and live without any charge. It's completely in the middle of the wilderness, and that's where we found ourselves in 1968 when we first moved there. Moving from Haight-Ashbury and hippie land and so forth, and we had to forge our way and learn how to live in the wilderness. And it's a beautiful place that has 2-year-long running creeks and a broken down house and broken down barn, and I lived there for 4 years. We had children there and everything. And I used to, not having lived in a situation like that before, I would take walks in the woods, in the mountains there. The forests are pretty gigantic around the Klamath and Salmon River. And I found myself, as I would be walking, being drawn to the various wild plants that were growing around. And I began to wonder what they were for, not knowing anything about it before. I guess as hippies in Haight-Ashbury, we were already interested in herbs because we were interested in forging an alternative lifestyle where we could take care of ourselves, feed people, and operate outside of the normal economy of this country. And the major herb that was being used and circulated then, which was a big deal, was golden seal. And everybody was using it for everything, and probably misusing it as well. So when I moved to Black Bear, I became aware of all these different other herbs that were there and began to wonder what they were. Not having any science background whatsoever, any medical background, I began to thumb through the few books that were available at the time. And we had a bunch of them. We had an herb room in the main house of the cabin, and quite a selection of herbs that we had accumulated there. So every time I'd come back with a handful of herbs from the mountains, I would be looking through the books and trying to assiduously find them. And then I learned, oh, lo and behold, this was used for this, and this was used for that, and that was used for this. And there was like herbs like Oregon grape and pipsissewa that grew there. And since our goal was to become self-sufficient, we needed to become self-sufficient in terms of our medicine and healing. I gradually began to fancy myself as the self-appointed medicine man of the community, and trying different things on different people as I would read about it. In those days, there were not many books, and whatever there was, I would struggle to use the indications that they gave, and the results were somewhat mixed, but we had fun. And so that continued to evolve over the 4 years that I was there until I really got very deeply into it, and began to wonder what the Native American people in the area, what they were doing, what they used for medicine and what they used for food. And I became good friends with some of the Kerock Indians who were in that area. And they told me of not only the herbs, but more or less their attitude towards them and how they used them. For instance, one woman who lived to a little over 100 was a Native American Kerock woman named Bessie Tripp. A funny name, but that was her whole family was called the Tripp family. There was a bunch of them that I was friends with. And she lived by the river, and she had congestive heart failure. And she knew I was picking herbs, and she asked me to go up in the mountains and pick pipsissewa for her. And I would go up there and with a big plastic garbage can bag and fill it full of pipsissewa and bring it down to her, and she would take the entire bag and have these big kettles on her stove, several of them, and stuff the whole thing full of those herbs, and boil the living daylights out of them, and then she would can them. And she would drink like maybe anywhere from a half a quart to a quart a day, and she would manage her congestive heart failure quite wonderfully with that, because it's got diuretic properties and relieves congestion in the body. So what I learned from that, and subsequently watching Native Americans in other places, was that you should use a hell of a lot of herbs. A lot more than these little tea bags that you put into a cup. And none of the books that I was looking at were really giving at all a decent understanding about how much herbs to use to make it medicinal quality. So when I moved away from Black Bear, again, I didn't really think that I was going to ever have a profession as an herbalist. It was mostly following my heart. It was a passion and a love and the desire to connect with nature and to connect with people and be of service and relieve suffering. But also because of an intense curiosity about the fact that plants, the role that plants play in our lives in such profound ways. I feel that we're really raised to be with plants, to live with plants, to use them for food, and to use them for medicine, and that was basically we all had that in our genetic strain to do that. That's what we're key to do, far more than dealing with synthetic drugs and things of that nature, which also I made my peace with, and I guess they have a place as well. So when I moved to San Francisco, I was invited to teach at a yoga center, and I started teaching about herbal medicine. Everyone wanted to know whatever I knew, because I came from the mountains, and it was kind of a strange situation at the time to see a mountain man in the city doing that. And my career sort of started there. And at some point, I realized that I needed to learn more than what I was able to be exposed to, and I found teachers in Dr. John Christopher, and who was like the voice in the wilderness for herbal medicine at the time. Remarkable human being who was on the plane every week, flying from one city to the next, lecturing to various people who had this kind of like secret remembrance of how herbs were important in their life at one time or another, and he would teach them about herbal medicine. He was a firebrand. He was amazingly inspiring, and I guess he wasn't surprised to see us long-haired hippies eventually coming to his crowd, because I think he sensed that there was an affinity there, because he was a rebel also. And then another woman who lived in BC named Norma Myers, who was a very powerful influence for us at the time. She had part Native American blood in her, and she made it her thing to visit all the local tribes up in BC and obtain all the knowledge she could from them about their use of herbal medicine. Devil's Club being a very important one, I guess, as you probably know. So between Norma Myers and Dr. Christopher, they were my first exposure to actual teachers. And I presented Dr. Christopher in San Francisco. I was the first to do that. I was very proud of that, and I brought him down to Santa Cruz. I wasn't living here at the time, and I had him give seminars here. And he was very popular and beloved by everybody. But eventually I felt like I needed more than even they had to offer. And I became, at Black Bear, I learned about acupuncture and actually started practicing it there. I was taught by people who had gone to England and studied it, practiced it, came back and taught me. And so we practiced on each other. If you can imagine the scene, we were in teepees and geodesic dromes, naked bodies, sticking needles in each other. And they didn't have any drugs or anything. Just kind of like experimenting and finding that it was effective. And I continued to learn about that. Got deeper into it when I came into San Francisco. I got together with a colleague, a fellow Blackberrian who had moved from the ranch, and we decided to find somebody who could teach us about Chinese herbs. We figured if the acupuncture was so effective, the herbs must really be something. And of course I knew about Chinatown, and I'd go in and out of there, and the Chinese were very conservative and very wary about sharing their stuff with us because they could practice based on their cultural background. But if they were found to be infringing on the laws and regulations and passing things on to Miguans, Americans, they would feel that they were in jeopardy of being able to maintain that. But so there I was, long-haired hippie type, going into these Chinese herb stores and haunting them, and they'd try to ignore me as much as they could. Except one store. It was a Chinese, it was called, it was on Washington Street, and a woman named Irene Ho and her husband was the manager there. Great China Art Company was what it was called. Art was always the front for these herb stores and acupuncture clinics in Chinatown, because they would have it in the back where they do the quote-unquote illegal stuff that nobody did. So Irene took me under her wing, and she taught me a lot about the herbs that they were dispensing and putting into bags and so forth, and giving to people, and I wanted to learn more. So we found a crazy Taoist guy named Feng Li Wang, and he also had an art store with a back room, and we went in and said, we want to learn about Chinese herbal medicine. He said, okay, $1 an herb. So he said he would teach us herbs, 10 herbs a week, $1 for each herb, so it meant $10, which back in those days was not that little bit of money. And so we went there, and I got to about 100 herbs. He would basically read and translate from a book and read to us about it. I had no idea what the herbs were, what they looked like, doses, or how to use them or anything. And I eventually asked him, and he said, well, when you learn 350 herbs, then I'll teach you how to use them. And I said, well, I don't think I'm going to stay for this ride. But I learned quite a bit from him, and especially he had quite a thriving business selling very high quality, expensive ginseng to people who swore by the results they got. Had people coming from all over, politicians, movie stars coming from all over the state. He'd show me his book with all these endorsements. So at that time I was practicing herbal medicine as I had learned it. Having the herbs in the back seat of my car, going to people's homes, seeing a bunch of people, doing iridology, which I since don't do anymore. And again, found limitations to all of that. But acupuncture got passed as a legal profession in California at that point. And so I was able to get an acupuncture license, which is a kind of a miraculous thing, and not entirely grandfathered in. I had to take a test, but nothing like what they're giving these days to people. And so I have one of the first acupuncture license, number 508 in the state. And so I began to do some acupuncture, and then there was a woman named Rosemary Gladstar, who many of us herbalists consider as the mother of mid-20th century herbal medicine, the renaissance of herbal medicine in the mid-20th century, because it practically completely died by the 60s. I mean, it was really, everybody had totally given into the wonder drugs, the antibiotics, the aspirins and stuff like that, and herbs were practically forgotten. I was actually the one who resurrected echinacea from oblivion. And I wish I had a penny for every echinacea product that was ever sold, but I'm glad that I was able to find it, because I selected it out of Jethro Kloss's book, and he had a whole list of herbs for infections and inflammation, and on the bottom was this really strange word, echinacea, and I thought, with a name like that, it's got to really be a good herb. I had no other knowledge of it whatsoever. So I went to a place called Nature's Herb Company on Ellis Street in San Francisco, which was the last surviving herbal pharmacy in the country. There used to be a lot of them. And people would write from all over the country to have them send their herbal remedies. And there was a herbal pharmacist there, a guy named Nathan Pothurst, who was a anti-Semitic, racist German, who I actually learned to love. And he wasn't very nice to his employees, but somehow or another he took to me, and I don't know why. I certainly wouldn't be the type of person that you would think he would take to at that time. And he'd tell me about the herbs there, and so I went into him and asked, "Hey Nathan, have you heard of this herb echinacea?" "Oh, that herb, nobody ever asks for that anymore. Maybe I have some at the bottom of a jar down in the basement." So he went down to the basement, and there was like maybe 8 ounces of old echinacea at the bottom of a jar, and he gave it all to me. I dutifully took it back to Black Bear, because staph infections were rampant in that environment, and I was using golden seal and getting mixed results with it. So I started. So I decided, well, I only got 8 ounces of this echinacea. What can I do to make it last? So it occurred to me that if I tincture it and make an alcoholic extract out of it, I can have people take it 30 drops every couple of hours, so it would just stay in their bloodstream consistently, and see how it works. Well, it was curing people's infections all the time, like 95% effective for infections. In fact, it was used before antibiotics came on the scene. It was used as an antibiotic for infections. So I let that echinacea stretch as far as it could, and started tooting the horn about it and talking about it, and now it is what it is today. Probably the greatest single American herb certainly on the western seaboard side. So all these kind of like firsts that I was involved with all came, I was just innocent. I didn't know what I was doing. It was a passion. It was leading me from one thing to the next, and I was just on this journey. I had no idea where it was going to go. I didn't think that I'd ever make a living with it. And when Rosemary finally called herbalists from around the country, there were only a few of us at the time, David Winston, Ed Smith, and a few others, to meet in Marin County at a ranch and give classes to each other and to people who were interested. I began to meet some other herbalists who were scattered all over the country, just individual ones. There weren't very many of us. We truly were breaking ground, but again, it was just a passion. We didn't know that it could ever turn into a profession. So that was a wonderful thing to connect with those people, and we started getting together every year at Brighton Bush Hot Springs in Oregon, and I began to propose that we form an organization where we could teach each other and share what we learned, because David would learn things from Cherokee medicine men on the East Coast, and Ed Smith would learn things from the Pacific Northwest further up the coast. And Rosemary, of course, was a fountain of information as well. So we'd all get together, and I thought we would share what we had to learn, and we'd share it with the public, and we'd all grow by that. And so I proposed that we form an organization. And they all kind of said, you know, we're all rebels. We don't want to have any organization. And so that went on for a few years where they kind of poo-pooed it until finally I went to Australia. I was pretty advanced in my practice as an herbalist and acupuncturist at that point, and I was invited to go teach in Australia. And I traveled throughout the Gold Coast in Australia, giving classes to naturopaths who were what the herbalists are called in Australia today. And a woman came up to me when I started talking about herbs, and she said, "How are the herbalists in America?" And I thought about it. I said, "Well, you know, really, there are no herbalists in America because it's not legal. It's like you guys have it here." She said, "Oh my goodness, and we use all the herbs that come from there." And I thought to myself, "Yeah, you know, that's true, and we need to have some recognition as being a valid profession." So I came back and I called David Hoffman and some of my herbalist friends, and I said, we need to get this organization going. And so it was from that we summoned some of the leading herbalists that we knew at the time together for a gathering at Christopher Hobbs' place here in Santa Cruz. And we began the American Herbalists Guild, which today is now the only and largest organization for clinical herbalists in the country.